Welcome to the HR Think Tank, our podcast that uncovers the power a trusted workforce has on team performance, culture, and morale. We gather insights from experts, business leaders, and HR professionals to help you lead your team more effectively. Here's your host, Kai No, CEO of Verify Now, a trusted provider of background screening services.
You've likely picked up that things are changing when it comes to the way we work. You've probably experienced some of these changes yourself. But what exactly is changing in the workforce, and what does it mean for the cities and regional centres where we live and work? Our guest today to help answer these questions is Dr Andrew Reeson, a behavioural economist and principal research scientist in the CSIRO's Data 61. Dr Reeson has authored over 70 research publications for the CSIRO, is a senior lecturer and fellow at the University of Sydney, has contributed to the Henry Tax Review, and currently leads Data 61's Humans and Machines Research Group. Welcome to the show, Andy.
So, thank you. Yes, thank you. Great to be here.
So, Andy, we've got you on board today because you work with the CSIRO, and for those that don't know, the CSIRO is Australia's government agency responsible for scientific research and has been around since 1916. CSIRO helps solve big, complex problems that make a real difference to the future of Australia and the planet. So, Andy, you're in a leadership position at Data 61 in the CSIRO, and you've moved from a career in biology to becoming an economist. That's quite a change from what I understand. Can you walk us through your career and leadership journey? Because I'm particularly interested in how you've come into this place.
Yeah, so look, it's an unusual one, but I guess I've always followed my interests. So I started out studying my hobbies. So, nowadays, when I'm not doing economics, I'm interested in, birds and animals, to be quite honest. And as a, teenager was, as a young man was obsessed by the natural world. Really, I still am. So, when I left school, I was fortunate to have the opportunity to basically go on and study my hobby, as it was then, biology. And I've gone through to work in many very current and interesting areas. So I started with ecology, as we all do at that age, wanting to save the world and do something that's interesting. But it's also one of the things I learned. While it is really interesting, it's also really challenging to work on. So, for example, my undergraduate dissertation, I did a project which was actually trying to work out how a bird called the European jay stores food. So they collect, nuts, acorns and things, during the autumn and bury them, and then they come back to, find them in the winter, and that's how they get through the cold winters at high latitudes. And my, research question was, how do they keep track of how many nuts they've actually stored? And the trouble with studying, birds in this case was it's really hard. I spent months working on this, and I had, I think, 6 birds, one of which didn't cooperate at all. So then I'm immediately down to 5, and that's really not enough actually to do great science on. So then I moved into smaller things where I could do more with. So I did my PhD in insects, and particularly in insect pathogen interactions. I ended up at a place called the Institute of Virology in Oxford, and something that's become very topical lately, of course. Yes, so in that role, when you do experiments on insect, you literally have thousands to work with. And the beauty of the particular insect I was working on was they breed every month. So every month you can start over and do another set of experiments. Then when even further than that, the main problem with insects is while they breed every month, they actually don't take holidays. So it was really tough, even so much as getting a weekend off. Never mind going away. So actually ended up gravitating into molecular biology that was kind of just getting going in those days, particularly in applied to address some of the ecological questions. So, for example, I was involved in some early work where we're actually sequencing genes back in the 90s to try and identify biological organisms based purely on their genetics. So it was fortunate to be involved in some very novel stuff back in those days. I guess you could say in economic parlance, what I was doing there was chasing productivity. So actually making myself more productive as a scientist, able to do more science with less time and resources by shifting down to those ever smaller scales. Then after my PhD, I came out to Australia, fancied something different. Figured it was a place that I would like, where there's lots of opportunity, and 20-something years later, I think I was right about that. I was working on, of all things, actually European wasps, which in South Australia, where I originally moved to, were considered a big problem. Then I ended up in Queensland working on pests in cotton crops. In both of these cases, I became very aware that actually, we were pursuing really quite narrowly defined technical solutions. We were trying to find a very scientific, a very top-down technical fix to these problems, but actually we hadn't, at the outset really considered the bigger picture, the human context and the social and economic context within these problems existed, and became aware as while trying to solve them, I guess technically in the lab, that actually there was a lot more to them. So, to cut a long story, at least slightly shorter, I enrolled in an economics course and spent my evenings studying economics at the University of Queensland. Actually found I enjoyed it a lot more than I expected. My goal initially was to better direct my biological research to make sure we got the right questions in the first place and that found the most useful solutions, not just the most technically elegant. But actually, economics and ecology are actually a lot more similar than people think. Very much about agents, whether they're individual organisms or individual people within an economy that interact within complex systems that are aiming to optimize their outcomes, be it their economic utility or their in the case of biological organisms, their reproductive success. They're doing this in the they're doing this in the face of many constraints. They have imperfect information. We have constraints based on our history, our cultural history, our education. Biological organisms are constrained by their evolutionary history, and they're continually trying to optimize as best they can and to make trade-offs with the resources they've got available. So actually, the concept of making the best possible use of scarce resources is actually common across biology, ecology, and economics. And even some of the same methods are used in both. Game theory, for example, has moved from one to the other routinely. So so these are actually two.
So the transition, so the transition wasn't as well, I'm going to use this term lightly, but difficult as my brain thought it would be. There were some natural connections or similarities, is what you're saying.
There were.
So you're just applying to a different group.
Yes, I think, I guess I'd always been interested in economics, and this is what attracted me to it. And then actually I found working in it, actually in many cases we're using many of the same tools. We use the same statistical modelling methods, for example. Infuriatingly call them different things, but underneath it's actually exactly the same methods that we use to analyse the world. So yes, I think if we look... If we look past the obvious differences, actually, underneath the bonnet, there's I think there's a great deal of common ground there.
And look, we're going to go into some of your research now. And before we talk about your more recent research, I'd love to just go back and talk about some research you and your team did in 2016. So there was an article that you published, or that was published by The Conversations, called "The Growing Skills Gap Between Jobs in Australian Cities and Regions," which we'll link in the show notes. And you presented some interesting findings about the different types of jobs that are more common in regional versus metropolitan areas. Now, we're going to talk about your more recent research, which is about the changing trends around how we work and the impact of COVID. So this research was released in 2016, and it was forward-looking, right? It was looking at the next 20 years in terms of where Australia was going. But can you give us some, context into how the Australian jobs landscape looked leading up to 2020? This is obviously, with the hindsight that we have now, but just if you could take us back to your 2016 research, that would be great. Yeah,
absolutely. So, pre-COVID, and actually, in some ways this hasn't changed, but certainly, pre-COVID, we had a very strong view that the future of work was bright and was good, albeit, and as is typically the case, somewhat unevenly distributed. So look, we started, our team at CSIRO, we started what we call our future of research work nearly 10 years ago. And look, at that time, there was this sense, almost a panic that technology was going to cause widespread unemployment.
Yeah.
I'm sure you saw reports coming from, papers, a famous paper out of Oxford University that said, 42% of jobs are, susceptible to automation. We did our own version for Australia, got something like 44%. But, these were fairly simple sort of modelling exercises. Interestingly, if you get into the literature, you find that there's actually nothing new about such panics. These go back, 100, 200 years. You see exactly the same
human
thing
nature, right?
occurring. Yes, absolutely. It's a very common response to technology. But that's also not to say it's entirely without foundation. The Industrial Revolution, for example, was associated with many such, moral panics about how it's, changing the nature of jobs, and jobs will be lost, and it will undermine society. And actually, real wages actually stagnated for around about 60 years then. So, so bad things, can and do happen with technology. But what we find is that, it's certainly true that technology does make some types of jobs disappear. So, one of my favourite examples is the photographic developers. I'm old enough to remember when you came back from holiday, you'd have, a couple of rolls of your precious film that you would then take to, in England, it was typically the local chemist or maybe a specialist, photographic developer. And, you'd hand them over and then, come back nervously a few days later and, you'd get, a handful of photographs printed out. Of course, those jobs have disappeared. Those really have been destroyed by technology, by the digital cameras that are now so ubiquitous. But at the same time, because this has made photography so much cheaper and less complex and more feasible for people to do, we've actually seen at the same time a rise in the number of professional photographers. It's now much more feasible to become a professional photographer now that you don't need a chemistry degree and a lab in your backyard to actually deliver the photographs to your clients. So technology does destroy some jobs, but it also creates new jobs or other new opportunities. It opens up many more niches, creates many more things that people can do. I mean, podcast host is another good example of that.
That's very much true, and it makes it more accessible. There's more people that can access it that have never accessed it before. But I want to tie this back to your 2016 research.
Yes.
What did you guys find as the skills gap between regional and cities?
Yeah. So look, overall jobs have been growing strongly in Australia, but particularly the highest skilled jobs. And those highest skilled jobs were actually becoming more and more concentrated. So, back in 2016 and in the years that followed that, actually those highest skilled and, that tends to mean the highest paid jobs were actually typically it was really only the very centre of our biggest cities, which was mostly Sydney and Melbourne. Even some of our other cities, I don't like to use the phrase left behind, but, certainly weren't, seeing such, strong growth as Sydney and Melbourne centres were. So, jobs are actually seem to be becoming more specialised. Yes, this, did seem to be associated with a concentration of jobs. And actually this wasn't what we'd anticipated when we started out doing this research. Of course, even 10 years ago, the basic technology that we're using today to, record this remotely, this all existed. We'd all seen this, and I think many of us had visions back then of doing our sea change or our tree change, now with technology we can go and, live at the beach and, and working remotely. But, in practice, we were seeing the complete opposite of that. And, actually in regional areas of Australia, they were, tending to lose some of these, higher skilled jobs. And again, the classic model is, once upon a time, a medium-sized regional town or even a small regional town, you would have had a bank manager, may have had say a number of accountants, a number of professionals who were serving that local area. What we see with the combination of technology and the increasing scale of many of these businesses is those now end up being served maybe from the large metropolitan area by actually more specialist individuals. So instead of generalist, accountants, generalist, bank managers, generalist finance professionals, each of those roles has actually become much more specialist and then tends to serve a wider area. And the very same technology that we imagine could have fueled our sea change or tree change in the first place, that of course also works in reverse and enables specialists located in a capital city where they can be co-located and can share ideas with other with a small number of other specialists in their field, can then service remote areas. So yes, some real, I think, challenges for regional economies, in the pre-COVID times, looking at those sort of trends.
That affects the appeal or the attraction for those who want to move out to some of these regional communities, because often people, look at amenities, school, food, education, services, and if those things are not available, then it makes moving out to those regional towns less appealing. So that's I guess an adverse consequence of technology. It's the same as shopping, like with retail, right? With the increased popularity of online shopping, and I guess an improved logistics arrangement within certain regional towns, people are just ordering online and then it's getting delivered to their door. That makes the local retailer really redundant.
Absolutely. So a smaller number of large-scale retail operations that will typically be based in, on the fringes of the capital cities, will end up serving in entire states and in many cases the countries. So yes, it has.
Well, we will link that. But what's the long-term impact if this keeps happening? Because in my international diplomacy type work, we always talk about the brain drain, in terms of youth from certain countries studying elsewhere and then not moving back to that country to help that. Let's say if it's a developing country, there's a bit of a brain drain. What's the impact for the city-country gap when you've got this example that we're talking about with technology?
So look, certainly, So again, we're talking pre-COVID. Obviously, things have changed in recent years, though, as we'll discuss, we're not quite sure how that's going to settle out yet. But yes, it does make it very challenging for smaller regional economies to maintain that sort of scale. That said, there are maybe niches that can be exploited. They can I think regions can do very well from specialising in particular areas perhaps, but there it needs to be something, I guess, that they have a comparative advantage in. We thought about this, for example. We did a report a few years back for the Fraser Coast, which is the sort of Harvey Bay, Maryborough area, sort of several hours north of Brisbane, which is one of those classic regions that's probably close enough to Brisbane to be well served by professionals from Brisbane, but still much too far away to, pre-COVID to be anywhere near sort of commuting zone. So yes, we're showing those same sort of trends of, actually to some extent a hollowing out of some of those, some of those most highly skilled jobs. There were lots of very, worthy ideas about trying to become a new technology hub or try to attract some new sort of, I guess, high-tech manufacturing and so on. But again, keeping them there would always be the real challenge in those senses. For an area like that, we were thinking with high amenity value, may do better to focus on on industries actually that enjoy less economies of scale, so maybe even becoming a sort of healthcare, sort of health and social care hub. In that case, I think there will be real opportunities for a region like that to build on its existing strengths.
So Andy, you lead the Data 61's Human and Machine Research Group. It's got some really cool names in it. What does this group actually look at? Can you just give us an explanation?
Yeah, look, we're really interested in those human aspects of technology. So, the behavioural and also some of the social and economic impacts of digital technology on our society. So, at the moment in technology, the biggest game in town is AI. So there's a lot of fundamental research to be done to understand actually how people can best work with AI. We hear a lot about AI taking over jobs, but actually many of the best jobs in the future are going to involve people collaborating with AI. And by AI, of course, I mean artificial intelligence. So, the best jobs in the future will involve people collaborating with artificial intelligence, and how we do that is actually really tricky. It will involve designing the artificial intelligence system in different ways. Our workers will require somewhat different skills, and actually the workflows where we put them together, we really don't know how to do that yet. So this is almost, one aspect of our research is almost trying to develop a new management science for combining humans and computers into actually teams of collaborators.
Andy, all I'll say is whenever I see new releases or exciting things about AI, I always then get followed up with comments around Skynet. Watch out for Skynet, famous, I guess, villain in the Terminator. For anyone that's watched it, there's always fear of that. There's always fear that it'll take over. I mean, if anyone's a Marvel watcher here, you'll know in recent movies, AI plays the bad guys as well. Yes. But it's all designed by humans. So, it was bad design that ended up leading down this path. So we always fear what we don't know, but it's exciting.
And we've also got to actively design those systems. So what the designers of Skynet, I would suggest didn't consider actually those social the social context into which it would be put and and how it would be used. So yes, we're very much about doing the research that addresses that, and actually putting ensuring that the humans actually stay in charge of the AIs by designing the systems in ways that actually work with the way humans work. And yes, I can't promise we'll avoid
there's
Skynet,
a lot of pop culture references, Andy, so lots of pop culture references, and fear is one of those things that stands out. So last year you worked with the CSIRO and NBN Co on some research. And you and your team, and it was called Staying Connected Report, which was one of the most detailed data mapping exercises undertaken in Australia to understand the behaviours and habits that have formed during the pandemic, in particular around the workplace and what the changing landscape looks like with more people working from home and I guess the carry-on effects from that. We're just interested, considering that we've all been dependent on NBN for work even prior to the pandemic, but more so. Like, I don't think I've ever had so many updates from NBN Co. in my life than the last maybe year and a bit. I've had so many infrastructure improvements, which has been critical, I guess, to me working from home. But I'd like to ask you some specifics about that research, right? So firstly, could you give us a bit of an overview of that study? What was involved and what were you hoping to find out?
Yeah, so look, obviously we've lived through some very interesting times, and as someone like myself who's interested in the study of how people work and where they work, COVID was obviously particularly academically very interesting in addition to the the personal challenges that we all faced. Yes, and through CSIRO we had the good fortune to do to set up a partnership with NBN Co to actually work with them to take a look at the data. And when I say data, this was of course done in a very in a highly confidential manner. We certainly never see any remotely resembling anyone's individual data. We really work with the with the team at NBN Co to look at aggregated data that we can use to address our questions. But we were basically looking. What we wanted to know was who is able to work remotely and when and where. So, the first part of this is, how do we get a measure of what is remote work? How can we tell when an NBN connection is working remotely? So, as a proxy for that, we looked at upload volume. So, of course, when you say stream a movie on Netflix or when you're browsing the internet, you're doing what's called downloading. So this is, basically getting information, getting video streams from the internet. If you are, video conferencing or even having a teleconference, as we tend to do when we work remotely, you're also sending a lot of data the other way. So we basically took counts of the number of NBN connections in any given area, and we came down to pretty small areas around about the size of a couple of hundred houses, and counted up how many of these houses were showing high levels of upload activity, indicating that people were doing something interactive from home. And we looked at business hours. So I think we took Wednesdays as our sort of representative day, being in the middle of the week, avoiding public holidays and things. And basically the counts the number of households who were showing evidence of working from home during the day. And yes, the goal was again to see, how the, shift to remote work, played out during COVID and how it continued to play out over, I guess, the first 12 or so months of the pandemic.
Yeah.
So what?
And it's fascinating to see it on a graph as well, Andy.
Yes.
We'll share a link to the report, but
right.
Seeing that graph between different states, and you overlaid it with when social distancing restrictions came in, when school holidays came in, and just looking at Victoria's one is just
it's
crazy.
It's quite remarkable, isn't it? And I mean, what was incredible, and even 2 or 3 years earlier, I don't think this would even have been possible, but the speed with which, literally within the space of 2 weeks, 40 or 50% of workers, relocated, in an instant almost, from working in their offices to working primarily from their homes. And this was an incredible shift. Unprecedented was a word that was thrown around a lot in those times, but it really does hold as a student of these things. We've been looking at these trends for years. Remote working has been in the census typically creeping from 3 to 4 to maybe 5%, and then almost overnight it's up to 40-45% of the population. And yes, it settled in there over the course of, I guess, the initial COVID lockdowns, as we called them, the initial COVID restrictions we had through April and May 2020. So basically pretty much a very large portion of the population, those who are able to work from home. And of course, we acknowledge that, many workers, in fact, slightly more than half of workers actually don't have the opportunity to work from home. So here we're really talking primarily about knowledge workers who were fortunate enough to have that opportunity. But those who did, certainly were certainly able to take it up. That activity did shift rapidly. It stayed there for those 2 or 3 months initially, and then as restrictions eased, so you're talking around about sort of June 2020 in most places, around about half of those people who'd been working from home actually appeared to go back to their workplaces fairly rapidly. So I guess I was maybe expecting a more sort of gradual return or a gradual decline. Actually, that most of those who went back did so quickly, and then in most cases then kind of settled in for quite a long time into a new normal with very elevated levels of work from home compared to what we saw pre-pandemic, way higher than it was, but around about half of what it was at its peak. Of course, sadly Victoria was the great exception to that, with the those extended lockdowns. Yes, through the latter half of 2020, and then of course working from home went up then even higher in Melbourne and stayed up there. And once again, as restrictions eased, many people kind of returned, but then again it settled into a new normal. Interestingly, I guess what I'm calling that new normal, so say here we're talking early 2021, where much of Australia was mostly COVID free for those times, and there were pretty minimal restrictions on workplaces, was that actually those levels of working from home did settle in somewhat different places in our biggest cities. That stayed highest in Melbourne even during times of COVID zero. Was also quite high, but not so much in Sydney, and a fair bit lower in some of our other capitals and particularly our regional areas. Unfortunately, we don't have enough jurisdictions in Australia for me to test this properly, but it did seem that that the amount of experience a place had with COVID and the length of lockdowns did seem to result in then the subsequent new normal settling at a higher level. So basically, people had spent longer, I guess, being forced to work from home, whether from due to lockdowns or maybe in the case of Sydney where there weren't those lockdowns in later 2020, but there was still definite risk of catching COVID. People the habit seemed to become more of a habit for people compared to places that had much less.
And Andy, we're talking about this 2.5 years from the first, I guess, lockdown, so we've got a lot of hindsight and optimism now, because I tell you now, if we had this conversation in the second or third lockdown, my mood would be very different to what it is now. How did the new work from home model affect people's lives outside of the new office? For instance, in terms of online socialization, as the new alternative for some, what was previously in-person relationship building, like what was the impact on that?
So look, we also we looked at socializing as well, because yes, you say one of the big problems with COVID was it was staying connected, not just professionally but also personally. People were literally unable to see friends, to see family. So yes, we also looked at we measured online social activity by looking at uploads on Sundays. So here making the assumption that people are less likely to be working on Sundays, but maybe they're video conferencing with grandparents, as for example do in my household regularly. And did even more so during COVID, when we were unable to see grandparents who live interstate. And yes, we saw actually a very similar pattern there. So once again, a remarkable jump in activity, with the initial, with those initial lockdowns, again, remained elevated, fell as restrictions eased and people were getting out and about again, but once again settled in much higher. So again, those habits also seem to have stuck. Intriguingly, with the socialising, that bounces around much more, is what we'd call in data science terms, it was much noisier. Actually, remote, people working from home was pretty constant. It didn't vary very much week by week. So this was a case of people actually, continuing to work from home and not doing what, I confess I maybe do sometimes, and sticking your head out of the door on a Wednesday morning, don't like the look of that weather, I'll stay home today. It was actually pretty constant, apart from I think we found one snow day in Hobart where we could see people clearly staying at home. Apart from that, people were pretty consistent in their behaviour. Online socialising, however, is actually very different. Really clearly responds to on weekends, people seem to spend a lot more time at home on video chats to one another than they do when the weather's fine, for example. But yes, it was, I guess, encouraging from a social policy, from a social connectedness point of view, to see, just how readily, large swathes of the population were able to move, their socialising activity online. Again, very grateful for these tools that we have at our disposal now. Are relatively recent and yes, enabled us to do that.
What's interesting about it is how quick some employers and some platform or software developers were able to capitalize on that need for socialization. I don't know about you, but I remember early on in 2020, there was this whole jump on, do trivia with me. There was all these games that you could do together. I even think about Netflix now, there's an ability to watch shows together, and that all came out of things like, the pandemic, because prior to that, it's why would I need to do this? Online trivia wasn't as popular, but it was one of those things where it was popular, but for a period of time, and then people got over it because everyone was doing it. I have not heard anyone invite me to any sort of online trivia in the last 12 months.
Yes, I think so.
There is no substitute.
Yes.
Look, there's no substitute for in-person catch-up still. I've gone to events more recently because, again, we had some restrictions at the start of this year, and people were just commenting on how great it is to see each other. Like tonight, we're going to, me and then actually some of the people from the studio here are going to an awards dinner tonight in person in Sydney. So there's no substitute for that.
It certainly made us appreciate that. But yes, and I think we've also learned, but there's a lot that it does substitute for. So a lot of work meetings have stayed online, such as, our conversation today has, we've been able to do this online, which we wouldn't have done previously. But yes, as you say, many of those, maybe many of the socialising things, I think the Zooming with grandparents is good, obviously not as good as the real thing, but you do it if you have to. But yes, other things like, I will confess that I tried the Zoom drinks on a Friday and I've concluded I prefer to drink alone, actually.
No, I think that was the conclusion for many, because there was if I was to comment, you tried to make it relaxing and easy going, but there was a forced nature about it because you're both on screen and you can't just relax and go for a walk here and go see this there, and then another person just organically joins the conversation. It's sort of everyone is there. It's like a stage presence. It almost felt like a show.
So and that's the great challenge. Something that's the vision for the metaverse. But yes, that's that one's.
I mean, look, I have meetings all the time with our interstate and international customers or colleagues, and we love that technology has enabled to do that. But from a socialization aspect, I think there's going to be a bit more of a balance. So
very much, yes. And professionally, it's enabled us to do more. And interestingly, as a scientist, I've actually participated in more international conferences during COVID because they're being done online. And
Same.
Yes, and I can participate, from here. I don't need to leave my family. I don't need to get, $5,000 from the boss to fly off and stay somewhere. So yes, it's opened up. It's opened up those opportunities in economic parlance. It's reduced the opportunity cost of attending. But yes, as you say, I think it's pretty clear for social interactions that it's better than nothing. But yes, for
a period of time, because too much of something is never a good thing either. So that's what it felt like. We were having too much of it. I read in the report that there was some comparisons able to be made between disadvantaged and advantaged areas in terms of socioeconomic factors. What did you learn there?
Yes, so look, we looked at that particularly with the with the socialising and also with people working from home, and look, reassuringly, we found actually it had really very little impact. So, again, this is a property we're looking at areas. So, we certainly don't see anyone's individual data, but those areas that tend to have more, areas that tend to have higher levels of disadvantage actually still showed pretty good levels of uptake of online socialising, for example, and even for online working, once you account for differences in occupations between areas, it wasn't obvious that any particular areas or demographics were being left behind by this. I'm sure there were individuals and households at the margin that we don't see in the aggregated data, but overall the benefits of this technology did appear to be pretty widespread. I mean, as you'd expect, that the most disadvantaged areas were showing a bit less activity, but all things considered, it was pretty reassuring to see that actually online activity did seem to have
that is good to know. Yeah, I think this is why it's important. We have these big infrastructure projects like NBN, the rollout of NBN, which occurred I think almost 10 years ago or over 10 years ago. This is why you need that, equality. And earlier you and I were talking about the skills gap between regional and remote. And again, technology, big infrastructure projects that are led by the government is important, because otherwise, if it's a user pay model, you'll see the disparity very clearly.
Yes, I think everyone having access was incredibly important. And yes, as you say, it would be unthinkable without the NBN, plus also our 4G mobile technologies that many other people used as well.
I've got comments on that, which, I won't add to this conversation today around the NBN code. Like, I've been following that journey very closely because I've had a lot of frustrations with the quality of our internet here, having traveled abroad and worked in other places. And you're thinking, how did these countries or places skip this whole fiber issue? And they're getting, a gig upload, a gig download sort of speed. And up until about 2 years ago, I was lucky to get 16 megabytes. And, I'm only 20 kilometers from Sydney. But this is not a part that I'm going to put in the show, but I'm just saying to you, oh my God, there were some frustrations. Yes. I could have a whole conversation about it.
Yes, it was. So, actually, it was notable. I certainly had colleagues. There's the occasional person who has a bad connection. And actually that was professionally really hard for them. They were, they kept dropping out of meetings, maybe 1 in 20 of my colleagues. I can think of several individuals who it just didn't work for them.
It was just difficult. But you were talking earlier about how, 10 years ago, before NBN, we had imagined this world where we could work from anywhere. There'd be all these rapid improvements in terms of healthcare. We had clients who envision video conferences and making health diagnosis and all that a lot easier. But there are still some real challenges today, which leads me to our next question, which is how do you think the changes you've seen in your research potentially affect geographical considerations such as commuting, our communities, urban development? I mean, what do you think about the idea of the Zoom boom, and impacts, I guess, on things like house prices and everything else in between that?
Yeah, well, that's the $1 trillion question. So, look, from our research with NBN Co, we found some early evidence that the Zoom boom is real, which I don't think would surprise anyone. But what we did there was we looked at some areas we looked at regional areas, and we were looking specifically for areas where the numbers of households where somebody appeared to be working remotely, working from home, had actually increased over the course of the pandemic. So basically where we were getting more people, in our case, we had data from, say, May 2021, and we were looking back to, say, August 2020. So basically, we're giving people, around about 10 months there to relocate, focused on New South Wales and Queensland. I'm afraid, obviously, in Victoria had limited opportunities for relocation for much of that time. And Yes, we found that, sure enough, some of those areas, perhaps on the fringes of those big cities. So in the case of New South Wales, particularly, say, an area called the Southern Highlands, which is an area, I guess, beloved of, maybe celebrities and other tree changers.
It's a nice area.
Yes.
It's a nice area. Yes.
So I gather, which is, an hour or so south of Sydney. Only a couple of hours from Canberra, so yes, I have been there from time to time myself. We certainly saw an increase over the course of the pandemic of people working remotely from the Southern Highlands, for example, which would suggest an element of Zoom boom, people relocating their work where they work from, presumably Sydney to the Southern Highlands. Similarly, the Northern Rivers region, particularly Byron Bay and surrounds, also sort of glowed red in our analysis, as did the Sunshine Coast, which is a couple of hours north of Brisbane. So yes, even in those relatively early stages, we could see clear evidence of increases in the numbers of people working remotely in these regions, but not in other farther flung regions. So yes, I think it's clearly something that's real, and yes, is going to have massive implications for for the way people work, and exactly where we live and work in the future, and has implications for.
Do you think it will influence government policy or investment? Seeing some of these early trends now, like we talk about sticky habits. It looks like it's not going to go away. Like it's one of those things where you've opened the box. People have seen the benefits from it. Either mental health, family balance, and commitments, enjoyment of work, whatever it may be. Like people aren't going to just give this back up. So, what do you foresee as the potential impact from a policy or investment perspective?
So I think it's very clear that much is changing. I'll emphasise that I'm speculating here, so this isn't what I see in the data, but this is building on what we see in the data, and I guess applying theory and a little bit of a crystal ball. Be very wary of economists making forecasts. We generally struggle to forecast what day it will be tomorrow, but nonetheless, yes, it's clear that hybrid work is here to stay for many of us. So for those knowledge workers fortunate enough to have the opportunity, surveys are clearly showing that the majority of office workers would like to work from home at least some days of the week, and clearly most of their managers, most of their employers are kind of hearing that. Interestingly, there's still something of a discrepancy between the two, but that's also I think that's pretty clearly narrowing. So yes, it does seem that for now the future of knowledge work at least is largely hybrid. So most people are still going to be going to an office, going to a place of work and meeting their colleagues in person, but I think are certainly not going to be doing what we used to do in the office that certainly 20, 30 years ago when I started out, even 5 or 10 years ago, an office was essentially a place where you went to sit at a slab of desk and work at a computer that was most of the places I work literally chained to the desk. We don't need that anymore.
I'm fascinated. Yeah, I'm fascinated by this because I've been working from home, or I guess hybrid arrangement, for almost, I'm going to say 7 or 8 years. So I've had the fortune of doing that. And yesterday, it's funny, I was just having a catch up with a friend, and her friend were actually traveling from America, and they were here still working.
Yes.
They didn't take off too much leave. They were just working different hours, right? So this flexibility, this notion of work from anywhere, some people are taking up.
Yes.
Now, I don't know the whole logistics of it. There's some complication, I'm sure. It's particularly if you're working US times, you're doing like probably 11 p.m. Sydney time until 7 a.m. over there. But if the productivity is there and the outcome is there, then that's what they're looking at. I guess from my perspective, the reason why we ask this question is I'm seeing a lot of people move to different places, places where they always wanted to live, but they thought, there's not enough job opportunities. But now knowing that they can retain their current job, but just live somewhere else, it certainly opens up their housing options.
Yes.
But what impact that will have, I guess we'll have to wait for a little bit longer to see what the research shows.
There's a lot of opportunity there, but yes, also a lot of issues also that managers and employers will need to work through. Yes, as you say, in the case of infrastructure, yes, big questions there. One would imagine there'll be a lot less pressure on the commute, and particularly the peak hour commute. Firstly, because only some office workers are going into the office on any given day, and even within that, we can still be flexible with time. So because so many of us have a good setup at home, even if I am doing a day at the office, that doesn't mean I need to be there at 9 o'clock on the dot. I can do the first hour here, and then get in the car when the traffic's died down. Of course, the game theorist in me tells me everyone else will be doing that. So yes, so timing that will become an issue. But yes, one would certainly hope that this is almost the dream of transport planners, is that very inefficient peak hour should for many workers actually be spread out a lot more. Yes, it will also lead to people living all other things being equal, I would certainly expect people will live further away. So there's something that, again, transport planners are fond of, called Marchetti's constant, or maybe Marchetti, which suggests that, people tend to live, no more than round about sort of 30 minutes from their place of work. Of course, there's variation around that, but on the whole, if you're getting much more than a 30-minute commute, one way, that's getting a bit extreme. Not so many people do it. Now, of course, if you're only doing the commute, say maybe 2 days a week, how does Marchetti's constant work in a world of hybrid work? I would imagine that it will increase. So yes, people will, outer suburbs will do well. Areas on the fringes of our major cities will do well, because people are able to go in places where housing's more affordable, or where there's greater amenity values, and where the cost of the commute is less severe, given they're now only doing 2 days a week. The example you give of people coming over, people travelling and working, I think is also an interesting one, and one that that itself will have a profound impact. Of course, people moving to an area and working remotely is one thing, but yes, of course, we'll see people taking up short-term rentals working remotely from the dining room table. That will have very big impact on property prices, and also availability. This is actually a whole swathe of extra properties potentially being used up by people who are if I were to do that, if I were to, relocate to the coast for a couple of weeks in a rental, my house here is sitting empty while I'm, renting a house somewhere else that, someone else isn't living in for that time. So, yes, it does have, there's a lot of big implications there, and some big opportunities for regional economies, with so many more knowledge workers being able to be located there, but also quite different to maybe the model of where once upon a time a firm would have relocated with all its people. Instead of a firm employing 100 people relocating and then interacting with other firms around it, you maybe have 100 individuals relocating and working from their from their new spare bedrooms or from their Airbnb.
There's a lot of opportunity. And I think at the end of the day, from the conversations I've had with many employers and employees, they're looking for a balance. It's not a binary choice where you're saying it's either all in the office or all from home. I think it's about choice and flexibility and bringing connection. I mean, one of our podcast guests came on the show recently to talk about how flexibility has allowed him and some of his peers who are Aboriginal to work on country. And that allows that cultural connection piece. Now, it's not full time, but if they could do it 2 weeks out of the month, it just allows that family bonding, that cultural connection, and also being role models for some of these communities that some of the professionals are from, and allowing young Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to see, hey, you have a really cool job. Oh, what? You're a marketing manager for, XYZ government department or company. That's cool. I didn't consider that. And so it was just opening up a whole nother world rather than you having to take off personal time to then go and work. It's like, nope, you can do this. I had a colleague who went back to the UK, worked for 3 weeks, took a week off, but that time after and before work to spend that valuable time with family who he hadn't seen for 3 years was just, priceless, basically. So it just gives these options. And Andy, I want to move to something that everyone loves talking about, and that is money. That is salaries, right? What do you think about the flow-on changes about how we work and the flexibility of work and its potential impact on salaries and job structure?
Question again. I'm, speculating here based on, published research and what data we have. But look, it's very clear that, again, for that, what is still, we must remind ourselves, minority of workers who are able to work remotely. Clearly, many, most, the great majority appreciate, they value that flexibility. So, it's clearly something that matters to those employees. And from an economic perspective, I guess we would certainly imagine that to essentially become a part of a salary package. And, one of the things that we'll be looking for is, will we see more jobs actually advertising, what flexible arrangements do they offer? Are they hybrid? How many days, where is the office and how many days would you actually need to be there, for example? So, yes, you would, imagine that all other things being equal, employees would prefer an employer that, offers them flexibility in terms of, how many days they need to come into the office and, not having to go into the office 5 days a week, but, maybe an expectation of 1 or 2 days a week would clearly be preferred by employees. So yes, I would imagine that in a war for talent, yes, companies would certainly, employers would certainly need to make themselves flexible to attract the best talent. I think, they also, we do need to be aware, that there's also a great deal of variety between individuals. Again, while, it's only some workers who are able to do their jobs remotely, of course, not everyone is fortunate enough to have a home in which, they can work, safely and effectively. So, I think workplaces will remain, very important for many. So, yes, I think one of the challenges for employers is how to balance that, how to provide flexibility for those who maybe
I have to say, Andy, we've seen employers get turned away when they haven't offered that flexibility by candidates.
Yes,
for some candidates, it is a prerequisite.
Yes,
if you don't offer it, I will not work for you. And like you said, in that war for talent and with the job shortages that we've had recently, like a lot of employers have had to come to the game and actually say, no, we offer that flexibility too. And sometimes it's worked, and some are just against it because it cannot work. They're saying it cannot work. And I understand that, because you're saying not everyone has the flexibility to work it because the role doesn't enable that, or the employer isn't set up for that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess with some roles it can be challenging, though I think most roles can be more, I think COVID has shown us that a far greater range of roles, can be performed remotely at least some of the time than anyone had initially envisaged. But again, it's also down to which individuals are best able to do it. To really work safely and effectively remotely, you probably need a spare room. You probably need a dedicated space to do it. I'm fortunate here, we're in the classic, outer suburban house with, 2 kids in a spare bedroom. So, in my case, it's been a fairly seamless transition. But yes, my younger self in those share houses, that young scientists love to hate, that would have been a completely different experience for example, and people with young children at home, maybe, particularly mothers, who are less likely to be left alone by their children, for example. There are many people who actually need a separate space to work. So yes, I think employers are going to need to be very aware that there are going to be a range of needs, and that yes, if done well, this can actually support a more productive and probably more diverse workforce. Yes, it can probably save employers money overall. They should need probably less offices, less desk space, but also obviously what the nature of those offices will vary. Certainly, personally, when I do go into the office, I'm not looking to sit in front of my screen for 8 hours. I want to be with people. I want to be talking to people.
Yeah. It's the connection piece. And that's the fascinating thing about, the cities and how that will be reshaped from this new work trend is there's been a lot of empty offices. There's been some huge stories about massive companies paying out their lease early because they're like, well, we're not going to renew it, or we're not going to take the 5 extra levels that we requested 3 years ago, and they've reinvested that to somewhere else. And how that will morph to the city. Does it mean there's be more residential? Will it be more community spaces, more leisure spaces? Does it mean there'll be less appetite for large buildings in certain, geographies? And are we going to go to more of a, low to mid density rather than high density? Australia's got a lot of land, right?
Yes.
So it's just fascinating to see where the world will go with this trend. Andy, it's been so great to chat to you. Thank you so much for sharing everything that you have with us today. Before we wrap up, we'd like to go through the Fast Five with you. That's where we ask 5 questions to get to know you a little bit better. Let's get started. What was your first job and why did you get it?
I was working in a small corner hardware store in an obscure corner of the UK. It was essentially, if you imagine, a combination of Bunnings and BCF with everything they stock in a shop about the size of a milk bar. Yes, good fun. We had enormous storerooms out the back, and I spent most of my time rummaging around out the back for obscure hardware items that I really didn't know what they were. I got the job because my mother knew someone and asked them, and figured I was spending too much time around the house, and was probably right.
Get out of the house, so they gave you the job. What's something interesting that's not on your CV?
Yeah, I look back in my days of biology, I guess, in terms of something professionally I've done. Actually, I ended up caught up as being a field assistant in the UK's first ever field trials of genetically modified organisms, which was very interesting, shall we say, challenging, a lot of issues to deal with. I'm not expanding any particular view on it, but it was a startling experience as a young and naive man to find yourself on what was literally the front line of both science, massive new scientific and technological development, but also, my word, enormous political and communications and media storm. So yes, a fascinating experience.
So why is that not on your CV? It's just you didn't spend enough time in it, or was it too many controversies?
I guess I really was just a field assistant. So I was the I was the person who got paid £5 an hour to carry the boxes in and out and to do the legwork. Okay. So I wasn't even the scientist, but this is what they used to use the starving PhD students they used to rope in and you'll come and help with this, and then you realise what's with all the protesters and some days most days it was just us there, but every now and then there were police vans and picket lines, and it was
and that's why you don't list it.
Well, it was it was a fascinating context, not just on the science, but yes, also on that intersection again of science and society.
What have you learned about leadership and working on a team that you would want to teach your younger self?
Actually, the people who disagree with me are the most useful. So often
good advice.
Not always, yes. So not always the ones that are always the easiest to work with, but that yes, I have come to realise, and I now literally value most those people who I can rely on to disagree with me, at least sometimes.
Provide a highlight from working in a trusted team.
So we've done some really nice novel data analysis down the years, and that really does take a village to drag data from different places, put it together, ask a coherent question with it. When we started doing our future of work research, for example, one of the main questions was, how is the demand for skills in different areas changing? So, we grabbed a whole lot of data, munged a whole lot of data together, as the young people call it, grouped skills into these different categories, and ran it through a model, and what did we find? Lo and behold, actually demand for skills in technology and knowledge work was kind of growing at trend, but actually the biggest single growth was in demand for interpersonal skills. And this is one of those results that you have a look at. You sort of try changing your parameters a bit. If we use the right data here, you try turning the model off and turning it on again and seeing if it still acts in the same way. But after lots of verifying, actually that was a result that held. So and this was something that at the time was quite novel, and since has been borne out by multiple other studies. But actually, as technology gets better, technology does actually more of the technical stuff. We need to get better at talking to the people. So this was
okay.
and that,
I'm keen to get a hold of that to be honest.
Yes, this
scenario
was in some of our original future of work stuff. That particular analysis was in a thing called Tomorrow's Digitally Enabled Workforce. And yes, the intuition.
Take that piece out. Lastly, what would you like your legacy to be?
As a scientist, I'd like to, make a contribution to knowledge, make a, ideally a revolutionary, but in practice an incremental contribution to knowledge will satisfy me. To do research that matters on, topics that are relevant to people. As a leader, my answer is actually not much. I think as a lead, certainly in my case, if as a leader one leaves a big hole, one maybe wasn't doing it right. So yes, I think in terms of in terms of leadership, once I move on, they shouldn't miss me.
Andy, thank you so much for all your time today and sharing with us your past research and your recent research. We'll certainly be keep in touch, and we want to see where the world is going, where Australia is going, and we'd love to share more of your research in the future. But thank you so much for your time today.
Yeah, my absolute pleasure. Thank you for the conversation.
Today's guest was Dr Andrew Reeson from the CSIRO's Data 61, Australia's leading digital research network, providing trusted advice to government, business and academia. We got insights into the skills gap between our cities and regions, how we're staying connected while remote working, and the Zoom boom that could change the shape of our towns and cities. You can learn more about Data 61 on the website linked in the show notes, and you can follow Dr Reeson on LinkedIn.
Thanks for listening to the HR Think Tank with Kai No. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and share our podcast with your network. Check out the show notes for any resources mentioned in today's episode, or visit the Verify Now website for more information.